Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce our next keynote speaker of the day, Mr. Siddharth Chatterjee. I'm very happy that you took the time to be with us today, representing one of the most important organizations, in my opinion, when it comes actually really to global developments. I mean, really, one of those organizations holding together very much some of the very delicate situations in the world that we are constantly being faced with. Mr. Chatterjee is the Chief Diplomat and Head of Strategic Partnerships and International Relations at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Mr. Chatterjee is a fellow and graduate in public policy from the Woodrow Wilson School in Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Before joining the United Nations, he served in the Indian Army as a career officer in the Special Forces and was decorated for gallantry while in service. Mr. Chatterjee served extensively within the United Nations in complex emergencies, fragile states, and developing countries, and held several leadership positions in UNICEF, the UNOPS, and the UN peacekeeping and operations. He started his UN career in Bosnia-Herzegovina, after which he went to serve in Iraq, Sudan, South Sudan, Indonesia, Somalia, Kenya, Jordan, and Denmark. Mr. Chatterjee led demobilization and reintegration of 3,551 child soldiers in the South Sudan during the height of the conflict in 2001. And he will also be giving a TED Talk on June 29th in Spain on a similar topic. So ladies and gentlemen, it's really a high honor to have you here. First of all, in terms of your extensive career, you've actually been there, you've done that, you've been in these complex situations. Also, given your current position at the Red Cross. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Mr. Siddharth Chatterjee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope all of you have had enough of coffee because I notice I have 1 hour to speak and I'm going to use all that time. Just kidding. Right. So, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you. I represent the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and I thank the Academy for Cultural Diplomacy for this invitation. We're pleased that we have this opportunity of sharing our experiences and exchanging notes with you on this whole issue of relief to development. Perhaps, as a start, let me give you a context of what the Red Cross, Red Crescent is all about. At the international level, the IFRC, together with 187 national societies, that means 187 countries, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, really forms the bedrock of the organization, or what the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is all about. So this is the whole. This is the whole as it comes together. And to us, the fundamental principles is sacrosanct. It is the honor code of the organization. It is about our neutrality. It is about our independence. It is about our humanity. It is the critical mass of what weaves this whole organization together. It's constituted of approximately 100 million staff, volunteers, and members. And it is the largest humanitarian network in the world. It's an organization that annually raises $20 to $30 billion and has 13 million active volunteers who contribute through their volunteer time close to $6 billion in ODA or in GDP when you were to compare it. So by virtue of scale, the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Society is massive. The other element, which perhaps is useful for you to know, is we look at 3 pillars of humanitarian and development support. The first pillar being that of the United Nations and the intergovernmental organizations. The second pillar being that of the civil society that comes together, which is the NGOs, the private sector, the businesses. But there is this third element. And that third element, which is ambidextrous. When I say ambidextrous, it's got a global reach and a local voice. It kind of falls between both of them. And let me explain with the next slide. The IFRC is recognized as an international organization by the Swiss government and enjoys the privileges and immunities like the UN and enjoys the same privileges and immunities in close to 70 countries. As per the UN General Assembly, A resolution was passed, 49/2, in 1994, and IFRC was granted the status of an observer. In this sense, it is treated like a specialized UN agency at the UN General Assembly. For example, between 2000 and to date, we have signed 40 partnership agreements between different international and regional organizations in our capacity of being an international organization. And meantime, at the national level, and that's what makes the organization very interesting, we cannot exist as a national society unless it has been legislated by Parliament or there is a decree that allows its existence to take place. So most of you that are present here perhaps have a Red Cross or a Red Crescent in your respective countries. They would not exist unless there is a government legislation that permits it to exist. And that therefore makes the Red Cross, Red Crescent an auxiliary to its government. And what does that mean? An auxiliary means that during the time of a humanitarian crisis, it becomes an arm of the government to help assist the government, keeping those fundamental principles that I referred to earlier sacrosanct. It then is able to support, assist communities at the local level. If you look at when a hurricane is on its way to one of the coasts in the United States, there are two entities that you see there. FEMA on one side, which is their Federal Emergency Management Organization, and the second organization that you see there is the American Red Cross. This is how we operate, in a sense, globally. So what I've mentioned now is what really is the comprehensive whole of what the IFRC, the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies, really represents. So I mentioned earlier, it is at the global level where we have all the high-level work that takes place here in Geneva or in New York or in Brussels or in Vienna, but we are also at the local level, and perhaps the only organization that has a presence at the community level. Next slide, please. So perhaps I don't need to go into the history because most of you would know about Henri Dunant and the whole principle of humanitarian diplomacy that really started. In fact, the humanitarian diplomacy strategy is based on advocacy and communications. And this really started with this gentleman who had the vision and a perspective of really setting the Red Cross, Red Crescent in its tone and texture. We have a responsibility to persuade. You've often heard about the responsibility to protect. But here is also a responsibility to persuade, regardless who the entity is, regardless who the person is, regardless the political affiliations or the ideological issues of that party. We feel that from a humanitarian diplomacy perspective, nobody is beyond persuasion. And our Strategy 2020, which really guides the vision of this organization, which was approved by the UN, by the governing board, and our General Assembly, which comes together in 2009, which approved this for the next decade. So our Strategy 2020, the theme of our Strategy 2020 is saving lives and changing minds. Now, if you look at it carefully, saving lives is the immediate humanitarian relief that you need to provide during the time of a disaster or a catastrophe. But changing minds is the sustainable development paradigm. It is about helping people, helping communities embrace the whole concept of sustainable development. Next slide, please. So how do we define humanitarian diplomacy? In the IFRC, humanitarian diplomacy is defined as the process of persuading decision makers and opinion leaders to act at all times in the interests of vulnerable people and with full respect for our fundamental and humanitarian principles. This is inviolable. And when you break it down into its subparts, what comes right front and center in this is people that are vulnerable. That's where our focus is. Regardless of caste, race, affiliations, it is vulnerabilities that we seek to address. So, in order to do that, there is a process. If you go to the next slide, our process, when we look at humanitarian diplomacy, it is an umbrella term. It is about going to decision makers, it is going to opinion leaders. Who are opinion leaders? Opinion leaders are people like yourselves here. Opinion leaders are, think tanks, universities, institutions that back our argument up, because we have to back our argument up with adequate evidence. We need to be interacting with policymakers, just as you are, talking to governments, talking to the UN. How do we bring about strategic changes? How do we bring about policy changes in order to support and assist the most vulnerable? It is also about quiet diplomacy, and that's why the word diplomacy. We don't have to stand with a blowhorn and sound out all the challenges that we confront. It is about using discrete methodologies with which we can actually be engaging on a one-to-one basis to try and do that second part that I talked about, is about changing minds. And finally, there is the public advocacy component, and where the communications part, where our advocacy part all comes in together. It could be op-eds in a paper, not no pointing of fingers, but it is about bringing together an issue. For example, talking about food insecurity, the linkages of food insecurity and natural disasters and potential conflicts, as we've seen in Somalia. So it is really about trying to bring attention to particular issues. And that is where the whole issue of humanitarian diplomacy really falls in this context. Can we go to the next slide? So for us, there are three critical issues. The three focus areas that defines our humanitarian diplomacy. Focus area number one, addressing the humanitarian consequences of the increasing number and severity of disasters. Ladies and gentlemen, in the 1970s, we used to have close to 40 to 50 major disasters globally. In 2007, the assessment was close to 400 major disasters globally. Now that gives you the story. The second focus area is bringing attention to inequitable access to health. And vulnerabilities are enhanced when there is inadequate health. And finally, our focus area number three is promoting a culture of nonviolence and peace at the community level. And that's where a lot of our youth work, a lot of our youth as agents of behavior change are really working day to day to try and see what we could do to try and make changes in that mindset. So, in a sense, our whole approach to sustainable development is underpinned by these three focus areas that I just talked about. Can we come to the next slide? What do we mean by sustainable development? So we look at, from our context, we look at sustainable development as defined by the Brundtland Report, which says our common future, which was published in 1987, which remains valid till date. Development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, the international community's commitment in sustainable development, therefore, is crucial and remains indispensable. This commitment, however, without local actions, cannot be transformed into reality, which is particularly needed for and by the most vulnerable. So for the Red Cross, Red Crescent, it is critical that we are able to ensure that the international community which gathered in Rio 20 years ago adopted inter alia the Agenda 21, which was about the 21st century, and the Rio Declaration, and again in 2002, the Johannesburg Plan of Action, Plan of Implementation. How interesting that we are actually going into a phase where we are seeing the next Rio summit, which is starting off. And as you know, it happens every 20 years. A very interesting period to see how this particular Rio summit is going to bear out in front of us. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the challenges that we see in front of us is quite stark. And we feel that those challenges have to be met by the international community's sustainable development and remain crucial, in a sense indispensable. So when we look at all of this, it is about building resilience at the community level. Resilience to us underpins sustainable development. Now, human and community resilience, in addition to the environment, social, and economic dimensions of sustainable development as stated in the report must be regarded as the foundation for inclusive and responsible sustainable development. For the Red Cross, Red Crescent, this is mission critical. The challenges which are brought on by globalization include climate change, poverty, financial and economic stress, communicable and non-communicable diseases. The menu is huge, but for the Red Cross, Red Crescent, effectively implemented, humanitarian diplomacy can persuade governments, thought leaders, private sector, civil society, and the public at large to act differently and to change the way in which our policy or our approach to further the sustainable development agenda. As we can see, income disparity, marginalization of communities, stark increases in natural disasters, conflicts all over the world. We are creating much more marginalization. We are seeing much more haves and have-nots. So the world that the people live in today is more complex than what we saw 2 decades ago, perhaps. New patterns of vulnerability are emerging, local and regional levels. How can we tackle the issue and their roots and have the world on track for sustainable development goals and the future of what the post-MDG environment looks like? Now, there are a few areas from the Red Cross, Red Crescent perspective where we feel that collectively we are in a position to make a change. And that change, again, goes back to what I mentioned earlier, from the global to the local perspective. And they both need to come together from a policy frame to a social advocacy frame to a social mobilization frame. All the thinking of the Paris Declaration or the Accra Accord or what happened in Busan needs to be translated into affirmative action. Now, to translate that into affirmative action, you need boots on the ground. Now, that's what the Red Cross, Red Crescent perspective brings. That boots on the ground perspective, that community level presence. Next slide, please. So there are a few themes around which we feel, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement feels, that are critical to the whole sustainable development agenda. And let me start with health, and I will explain these. Health is a fundamental asset for sustainable development for each individual. For more than 3 decades, after the groundbreaking Alma Ata Health for All declaration, we testify to the efforts and achievements in improving the public health of many countries around the world. However, in spite of the progress made, health inequalities across the world continues to exist. This reflects achieving sustainable development. We still have much to do to address the social determinants of health, improve access to health services, health messages, commodities, tools, infrastructure, and reduce the risk of ill health, including environmental health hazards. Human resilience through good health must be included in the promotion of sustainable development at the community level and through policy at the central government level. Let me take Club 25 as an example. It is worth noting that in this so-called Club 25 programs initiated in Zimbabwe, young people play a pivotal role in securing safe and adequate blood supply from the very beginning. In a club-like atmosphere, they unite in a wide range of health-related activities like visiting people with HIV and AIDS, teaching healthy lifestyles amongst their peers, learning about nutrition, importance of exercise, attaining life skills, avoid drug abuse. Resulting from humanitarian diplomacy, through awareness-raising training, the increase of self-esteem, a sense of belonging, and leadership of young people in maintaining communal solidarity and social cohesion are just some of the byproducts of this movement for change and good health, which contributes to sustainable development. Give you an example. India today is turning into the diabetes capital of the world. Non-communicable diseases is the new threat, the new sword of the Damocles that hangs over us. 4 parts of the 4 continents already have more morbidity and mortality from non-communicable diseases than vaccine-preventable diseases. The UN agencies, the Red Cross movement have done a great job in immunizing children from many of the vaccine preventable diseases. But this is the new pattern, the new phenomena which is taking over. What does it come down to for prevention? Is our volunteers working at the community level, bringing in awareness and embracing and encouraging a healthy lifestyle. Second issue, the environment, and appropriate disaster preparedness education and risk-reduced environment. Now, although joint efforts in the aftermath of disasters or emergencies can reduce the direct effect of disease, famine, malnutrition, experience has shown, and IFRC is committed in this direction, that preparing for disasters contributes to the safeguarding of life and livelihoods in the urban and for the urban and the rural poor, who tend to be most prone to these disasters. Disaster risk reduction, therefore, requires long-term thinking and programming and also contribute to migration and adaptation of climate change. In addition, emphasis should be made on education, formal and informal, for a change of mindset to prevent further environmental degradation brought on by unsustainable consumption, use of renewable fuel generation of solid waste causes transboundary pollution, as we've seen globally, toxic wastes, and global environmental change. Therefore, this compels community engagement. This needs community engagement. That becomes critical. So let me add here that a joint humanitarian diplomacy effort which took place in Busan, in Korea, during the high-level forum last November. And in the outcome document, paragraph 27, for the first time, the international community actually looked at disasters. It was a new element compared to what came out during the Paris Declaration of 2005 or the Accra Accord of 2008. This inclusion was not simple, but it was a collective work of diplomacy, humanitarian diplomacy, quiet advocacy. So we came together with the Canadian and the Korean governments, along with the United Nations ISDR, and with the IFRC, we were able to bring in disaster as a paragraph and the whole issue of risk reduction in the Busan outcome document. The mentioning of investing in resilience and risk reduction increases the value and sustainability of our development efforts, provides a space for the Red Cross, Red Crescent for its discussion with authorities and national society support for its implementation from the national to the community level. National societies may also use its influence with authorities for disaster risk reduction and resilience to be recognized by governments as one of the priority issues to be addressed through its inclusion in the post-MDG agenda and in the context of sustainable development. That's the whole conversation. If you see the tweets all over the world, the whole discussion is about what post-2015 is going to look like. Every one of us have a stake in that. Every one of us have a responsibility to ensure that the community voices get heard at that global level. IFRC made a commitment of 10% of all its emergency appeals that are funded. 10% of those emergency appeals will go towards disaster risk reduction and building of resilience. And we've appealed to all governments, all international partners and donors to do the same. IFRC's Secretary General, Mr. Bekele Gelata, passionately believes that supporting communities to be resilient helps them to bounce back and forward after a disaster, and risk reduction is integral to building of resilience. Third issue, the social part. Meeting basic needs and promoting respect for diversity encourages inclusive sustainable development. A society which promotes social sustainability for development meets first basic needs for food, shelter, education, work, income, safe living, working conditions. That's the minimum. That's what we take for granted in our environments, but many parts of the world, many of those are missing. It provides a soft infrastructure of the community and an enabling environment for the well-being of people and development of human potential for the whole population without discrimination. It encourages democracy and citizens' participation and involvement in the decision-making process, which is essential to build a society of inclusive, sustainable, and to promote sustainable development and promote respect for diversity. We have to recognize the positive contribution all parts of society can bring to foster mutual understanding and respect for human dignity. Given the changing political environment, such an increased mobility and migration, we must truly reflect the makeup of population and their organization, and to increase the participation of all in the development paradigm, in the development discussion, through different initiatives and activities, including engaging in voluntary services and social relationships that comprise a community. Let me share some thinking in the area of migration. As globalization makes migration an inevitable fact of life for all countries, there is, however, a growing public concern about the visibility of difference within communities and the changing demographic landscape. These pressures have contributed significantly to the vulnerability of migrants and their families. In this regard, IFRC argues for national level action by governments, but recognizes that this action needs to be within agreed international norms and standards. These standards must recognize the rights of the migrants themselves and ensure access to points which meet their needs, including access to legal remedies. The IFRC therefore uses the International Convention on the Protection on the Rights of all Migrant Workers, members of their families, as a reference for its humanitarian diplomacy work, and urges that all states, especially in countries, for the implementation of this convention. We need to promote respect of these rights and the needs of the most vulnerable that humanitarian actors provide assistance to unconditionally. We must also encourage governments to support ways of fighting discrimination. Integration and non-discrimination are factors that can enable migrant populations to maximize their contributions to host society and reduce the risk of disaffection and instability. The fourth one is economic development. Economic development starts with resilient livelihoods at the communities and with respect to ecosystems and environments to ensure its sustainability. Poverty reduction and human development are central to sustainable development. Development is sustainable where livelihoods are resilient, local coping capacities are strengthened, and where people are able to earn sufficient income to meet their needs. Interventions with aim at increasing resilience of local communities to existing and future threats will ultimately also contribute to regional security, personal dignity, and support communities. Every day, economic decisions and choices are made and have consequences to sustainability. Ways to improve the lives of impoverished people without further degrading ecosystems need to be found. Engaging individual and communities in understanding sustainability, participating in the process of building a sustainable economy, make green purchasing decisions much more essential now. The IFRC's annually published World Disasters Report, it is like UNDP's Human Development Report or the World Bank's World Development Report, is a very powerful humanitarian diplomacy tool with decision makers, academia, and the general public. For example, with increasing adverse effects of food insecurity to promote the understanding in related areas, in 2011, the World Disasters Report provides an in-depth analysis on the causes and impact of hunger and malnutrition. It looks at community, national and international levels, both during and after emergencies and over the longer-term perspective. It examines the challenges associated with the globalized nature of food-related vulnerabilities and need to move towards cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary approaches. This report also acknowledges the complexities involved and the issues of global food security, hunger and malnutrition that go to the core of virtually all major components of the functioning of the international system, including climate change adaptation. Following this launch of this report in 2011, IFRC has been actively engaged with the international community, for example, with the G20 leadership, with the Committee of the World Food Security Council, with key stakeholders of the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Durban. A joint study was undertaken between IFRC and the International Food Policy Research Institute based out of Washington, D.C., a premier institution on food policy. And we disseminated a report which highlights the challenges of reducing vulnerabilities to food insecurity and recommendations for remedies to reverse the situation through intervention at all levels. The president of the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies, Mr. Tadaro Konoe, met with the Director General of FAO very recently, Mr. Jose Graziano da Silva, and they discussed a potential partnership to work together to reduce food insecurity and vulnerability. Two giant institutions coming together. We are reaching out to other partners to really put the spotlight on what food insecurity can do and the potential consequences it can have. Lastly, and most importantly, we keep hearing about it, is good governance. Good governance through capacity development for effective institutions and ownership at local levels and effective partnerships at all levels for sustainable development. Local communities have a significant role to play in the design of a national policy agenda, especially since the impact of global threats such as climate change is often felt first at the local level, at the community level. Local communities must be empowered and encouraged to participate actively and consistently in conceptualizing, planning, and executing sustainable policies. The IFRC is committed to capacity development of its national societies. And as we understand that only strong and accountable local institutions with decentralized approaches to policy design and implementation can be really effective on the basis of our national and our global agendas. It is imperative for governments from developed and developing countries to work in partnership and with their counterparts in governments, the United Nations and the international organizations globally, and with the civil societies, with the private sector nationally, to make a difference in the future and the lives of the most vulnerable. For the IFRC, the national systems and institutions, including the Red Cross, Red Crescent, as auxiliary to their public authorities, must be the center of planning and implementation processes. Capacity must be developed within countries in need to create an enabling environment for effective service delivery to the people at the community level and to promote inclusive development processes and addresses the needs of the most vulnerable. The Red Cross, Red Crescent is a people's organization, and therefore people form the bedrock of what it is all about. It is about preparedness, it is about mitigation, it is about response, it is about recovery, because we truly believe that local ownership and capacity development are key for enhanced community resilience. With our humanitarian diplomacy efforts from the international to the local, we keep reminding our partners that only by doing this together, through reducing vulnerability and enhancing capacity, we can achieve ultimately sustainable national development agendas. Having said so, let me add a word on volunteering, and that is what drives the spirit of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, that spirit of volunteering. More than in dollar values, in terms of the social capitalization from volunteering, volunteering creates good citizenship, fosters local ownership, and promotes accountability of governments. In terms of national society's contributions to country development, globally we estimate that the Red Cross, Red Crescent volunteers alone add close to $6 billion to global GDP through their freely given labor and skills. Now, if we add this contribution to the other voluntary bodies, perhaps volunteering contributes some $10 to $15 billion annually, which is close to 10%, equivalent of 10% of current official development assistance globally. Let me come to the last slide. So here, let me bring about an important point here. In 2011 was a year of catastrophes. We had the world spent close to $350 billion worth of assets were lost, and it was a costly year. Countries spent a lot of their development money towards responding towards these disasters. The Red Cross, Red Crescent is taking a clear message of sustainable development, which is highlighted through the examples that we've given to key audiences all over the world. For us, it is about investing in resilience. It is about investing in risk reduction. It is about investing at the community level. Can we actually ensure that we may not be able to prevent a disaster, but we can at least ensure that communities do not remain in a state of vulnerability and the fragility increases, but are able to bounce back, as our Secretary General says, or bounce forward in order to move on to meet the sustainable development objectives. Next slide, please. So let me close this intervention with an urgent call to all stakeholders of sustainable development. We must recognize that no development is sustainable without empowering women and youth. And they remain very much central to what IFRC does. Women and youth empowerment must remain a central policy, not just for the IFRC, but for the entire world. Through better education and employment opportunities, more direct control over resources, more inclusion, and a voice in decision-making can bring a change to today's world. IFRC continues to place women and youth at the center of its work through humanitarian diplomacy at all levels, and continues calling the involvement of women and youth for forwarding sustainable development. Youth represent the future. Their ability as a transformative agent, their ability of social change, we've seen that with the after effects of the Arab Spring. They can be the real barometer of sensing how fragile a situation is. And that same youth can be translated into energy of great positive change. So I would really urge that even here amongst the audience, that message of involvement of women and youth at the center of our sustainable development agenda remains critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chatterjee. I think that was an excellent way of also following up on the keynote addresses that we initially had this morning. We saw initially global governance, so really what is the role of the public sector. Here, I think you managed to inspire us all in terms of also the power and the role that citizens and civil society have. And I think your remarks in terms of volunteerism in particular can go really very far in terms of how we can also have an impact in the global picture. So for many reasons, I'm very grateful for the keynote address. And we now have time for questions and discussion. So I'd encourage you to be as active as possible. This is really your chance the next 3 days to ask the questions that you are most interested in. As always, if you could briefly introduce yourself, just tell us your name, maybe where you're coming from. That'll be a way also over the next few days for us to get to know each other as well. I think the first hand...
Hello, my name's Henna Khan. I'm from the Netherlands/UK. I'd like to know, and correct me if I'm wrong, if there is any organisations which encourage schemes bringing unemployment from the West to poverty-stricken areas to help reduce poverty and to increase training, because I feel that if there's qualified professionals in developed economies, they should go to the poverty-stricken countries and encourage training and encourage more employment. And also, especially you mentioned the women, there's many qualified professional women who struggle to find employment in the West, and this would be something which would provide an ideal role model for women in poverty-stricken countries. So, yes, that's my question.
I was in Iraq from 2007 to 2009, and we were trying to set up at the governance level, at the governorates level, commissions for ensuring that we could actually have these elections monitoring commissions in place. So we put out advertisements over the internet, and we were surprised by the number of women that actually applied to it. And the qualifications of women actually was much better than the men that applied to it. We had far more women that actually had master's and PhD qualifications. And I suppose giving women that opportunity, the cross-border, the global opportunity, would perhaps actually could actually be one of the determinants in terms of human development that actually contributes towards poverty reduction. So I completely agree with that. I'm not sure if that was a question or a remark, but I completely agree with it.
Roberto Bonino from Geneva. You mentioned a striking increase in the number of disasters over the last years. What are the areas that are responsible for that? Is this war, natural disasters, or what?
It's a sum of everything. It's from climate change to the man-made element to environmental degradation. It's just different ranges of shocks. And, perhaps, I can't really, it would be imprudent for me to kind of give it a scientific veneer because I'm not qualified to do that. But clearly what we are seeing in terms of the way temperatures have changed. I mean, last year I arrived in Geneva from the US, and I thought I'd, gone to New Delhi. It was so hot. And this winter, it was suddenly so cold. Even people in Geneva said that, this is the coldest winter they've seen. So we are seeing dramatic climate changes. We are seeing rising of sea level. We are seeing increasing number of earthquakes. Perhaps they get reported much more than they were reported then, perhaps because, we have access to internet. But I mean, the issue is, clearly, we are seeing a much larger uptake of natural disasters. And these are natural, which perhaps humankind is also contributing to.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I'm Karima from Morocco. You mentioned that there is no sustainable development without women and youth empowerment. And my question is how your organization is working to empower women and youth, knowing the fact that there will be no empowerment if there is no rights and no laws that guarantees women and youth inclusion and participation in decision making. Thank you.
But that's a very good question. And I believe that this is a collective responsibility, and that's why we use the word of humanitarian diplomacy. It's very important that at the national society level, where the Red Cross, Red Crescent is present in countries, it actually engages. It does engage with a lot of the policymakers. We engage with a lot of the policymakers at the global level. But we also engage with other partners in the UN system and the international NGOs and the international community to constantly bring to bear this whole issue of the involvement of women and youth. That is why we engage with parliamentarians to try and see if they can, this is what we would term as legislative advocacy, legislative diplomacy, really talking to policymakers to try and see, bring out 2 or 3 important case studies and show to them about bringing more women into the forefront, giving more women more empowerment, giving the youth a voice would perhaps enhance their sustainable development objectives, would perhaps contribute to more stability in the country, would perhaps contribute to a sense of self-worth and dignity. So I think these are all very important components. And today, remarkably, what social media has done is given everybody a voice. Previously, I think 20 years ago, we may have been invisible. We had to depend upon one leader and through whom we got a voice through. Today, through our Twitter accounts or through our blog sites, everybody has a voice. So I think that gives it an interesting dimension.
Additional comments or questions? Okay.
Yes, Dominique Walter from France. I would like to ask a question specifically on risk management in the Himalayan region. I've been working for a few years in Nepal, and now due to climate change, there is a risk, a very great risk with the glacier lakes which have been formed recently. I would like to know if there is a program, a prevention program, which is now implemented, or if there is a plan to implement such a program of risk of prevention. Yes.
Melting of glaciers has an effect on Nepal, on India, on Bhutan, on Pakistan, on China, and I just hope that there is a collective sense of urgency. Disasters have become much more cross-border, be it natural disasters of floods or earthquakes or a tsunami, as we've seen, and melting of glaciers. So I think, perhaps this is why the climate change process and the climate talks, which are so important, the next climate talks, as you know, is taking the climate conference, COP18, is taking place in Korea and Qatar. It is important that the voices of people such as yourself should get to the policymakers. Civil society organizations have to be far more active in terms of bringing attention to the reality that, look, having these kinds of global challenges will create much more refugees, will create much more displaced people, and the risks of other countries having to accept also these increased migrants simply because their homesteads have become untenable. They can't live there anymore. So I think there is a collective sense of responsibility that needs to come with it. And I'm sure that for us, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, this is an important issue. The whole issue of climate change, the whole issue of climate change adaptation too. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Candice Heath from the Global Sustainability Institute in the UK, and you've kind of touched upon this in the previous question, but I wanted to ask you, in your view, what are the main barriers for action on climate change and sustainable development, and what is the importance of sharing how organizations and people overcome these barriers?
It's interesting when you look at the different COPs, starting from Copenhagen and before that in Bali and then Durban. The whole issue is that there is a sense of, particularly in countries such as India and China, that the developed world has had all the benefits of industrialization, and they are being asked to drop their account for their carbon footprint, so to speak. I suppose what needs to happen is that global consensus. And I think in that global consensus, it is critical there is leadership. There is leadership from global leaders. Finally, they make a difference. It needs to be President Obama. It needs to be the head of the President of China. It needs to be the Prime Minister of India. Everybody really coming together and achieving an accord, an accountable accord. I think the climate change conferences are doing that, are trying to bring that sense of solidarity and consensus. But solidarity doesn't come overnight. It's a process, like many other issues. So I think it will come. I think the more the globe sees it, the more scientific evidence, because ultimately it also boils down to the kind of science and the evidence that we are able to produce. Because evidence can apply to reason and logic. But then we must use the powers of persuasion at our disposal too. And that is why national civil society action is so important, that their own governments, the influence that you can have with the British government or you for that matter with the Dutch government, in terms of really making sure that harmonizing that sense of consensus and no one feeling that, oh, I'm being forced into a deal, is what is needed. And I think that it's not far away. It's just a matter of, because increasingly there is growing recognition that global climate change is a challenge, is a threat, and that's something that we have to deal with. The matter is how, where, and when that needs to find resolution.
Oh, hi, my name is Xiao Chen from China. You mentioned about the importance of good governance. So I guess my question is, I think people now are questioning the democratic crisis in the UN system or in the EU. So how do you think a good global governance is possible working for today's world? For example, in terms of food security in Africa, how do you think the role of global governments? Thank you.
I'm glad you raised the issue of food security in Africa, because that is where the greatest challenge really lies. I mean, we've recently seen the Horn of Africa crisis. We are seeing an ongoing crisis in the Sahel. And it's been repeating itself. Africa yet has the opportunity of really becoming the breadbasket of the world. There are many countries that actually invest in agricultural land in different parts of Africa to be able to grow their own food, so that there is enough of a supply there. And I think this is where there is a global responsibility to make sure that Africa is not only food sufficient, is food secure, but is able to export food out. And that is where opportunities, both in terms of tax exemptions, opportunities of export, opportunities of ensuring that the farmer gets a reasonable price for his crop. And I think the focus really needs to be the smallholder farmers. I know for a fact that organizations such as IFAD, FAO, are working towards putting the spotlight on smallholder farmers. But again, the global governance issue comes into this. The collective issue from the United Nations side, the collective issue from the board of different organizations that come together to look at it carefully and to empower that small landholding farmer. But then working with those African governments, working as partners, not as someone providing instructions to them, but truly as partners, providing capacity development that we talked about, because it is, after all, about capacities. Capacities from the national level to really the most rural level. And I think that collective partnership is what will hold the key. And that is why I emphasize building of national institutions, developing the accountability, developing the capacities of national institutions become critical to take a lot of the sustainable agenda forward.
Hello, I'm Jana Berg from Finland, but living here in Switzerland. I was wondering, in your own organization, the whole concept of humanitarian diplomacy is very interesting. Is there a way, or do you measure the impact of that?
Very good question, because ultimately we see humanitarian diplomacy being an enabler. It's a catalyst, it's a tool. So it's not the end of it. Humanitarian diplomacy we see helping to open the doors, helping to enlighten the path. It is about trying to persuade. And once we've persuaded a policymaker that we need to get resources, we need to get help to a particular vulnerable community, that needs to be backed up by programs that should be able to go through and implement that program. So I suppose the test would be, has humanitarian diplomacy been effective from the local level to the global level on some of the major issues that we are talking about today? from climate change issues, to the migrant issue, to people in poverty, to the most vulnerable, to health inequality, some of these issues that we've taken upon ourselves. So I suppose 10 years from now, when we will look at our own strategy 2020, one of the things that we will try and also do is see how successful we've been in terms of taking the humanitarian diplomacy agenda forward. Because we feel finally it is not a program by itself, but it is really an enabler. And we hope that everybody in the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement actually becomes a humanitarian diplomat.
If I can just add there too, I think that's also the cross-section with cultural diplomacy. We identify two primary forms of cultural diplomacy at the Institute. One form is direct cultural diplomacy, where we have the direct intention of building dialogue, understanding, and trust between two groups. The second form is what I call indirect diplomacy. That would be what I would say humanitarian diplomacy is all about. Sometimes there are cases in the world where you have two groups that don't want to work together, two groups that maybe don't want to resolve a conflict, two groups that don't want to collaborate. That's where I think indirect cultural diplomacy can really be effective. So it's not a matter of us getting together and me presenting my culture and you presenting yours, but it's a matter of us getting together to do something else, whether it's humanitarian aid, whether it's volunteering, whether it's playing soccer. And I think that indirect approach sometimes is most effective, especially in areas where there are conflicts. So that's where I think the Red Cross is a great example. You've got, I think, every ethnicity, every nationality, everything coming together in the span of the Red Cross. And even though that may not be one of the direct missions of the Red Cross, I think you are, in effect, establishing a very important cultural diplomacy that does build trust, that does build understanding, while also benefiting society through the work you're doing. So that is a very interesting cross-section there also, I think, with cultural diplomacy. Before we conclude, is there a final question or a comment? We can squeeze, I think, one more in. Anyone would like to make? Yes? Okay, please.
What do we do when there isn't consensus, when you have climate skeptics, when you have people who are trying to prove that the science isn't valid, for example? How do you move forward in those kind of environments?
Well, more persuasion, more cultural diplomacy, more humanitarian diplomacy. The issue is that there are many climate skeptics there, and for the right or wrong reasons. But the important issue is that ultimately there is a kaleidoscope. That kaleidoscope is climate change in front of us. We are seeing it, we witness it, we experience it. Now, the point over here is, how effective are we in our efforts of humanitarian and cultural diplomacy at the global and at the local level? Because the local level counts, the community counts. When it goes back and tells its policymakers, we are not happy about the legislation you've done because it is impacting. You're clearing up all these forests to prepare a dam for us. We don't want that dam. You've seen this whole issue in India actually play out in global media, where a lot of our tribal communities didn't want a particular dam to come up because they felt acute deforestation would make them much more vulnerable to floods. So I think it has to work both ways. So communities, and the community voice is strong. As countries are democratizing, we've seen that in the Arab Spring, the voices of the communities will begin to matter increasingly. Civil society action begins to matter. And the important role of the private sector into this. They have a role to play too. So I suppose it is about trying to achieve global consensus. We may not see it overnight, but it's a process. And it's a process of erudition as well. People get educated about it. Perhaps even with you, what was your perspective on a particular issue, say 10 years ago, may have quite dramatically shifted by now. I know we may not have the luxury of time all the time with us, but I hope that around the climate change issue, it's taken much more seriously, because climate change ultimately is impacting food security and many other things.
All right, well, on that note, I would like to ask everyone to please join me in expressing our sincere gratitude to Mr. Siddharth Chatterjee. Thank you.
Thank you.